I'm Mitch from Beyond the Woods, and in the fifth part of this series, I'll be comparing the ease of use and depth of control between the Fractal Audio AX8 and the Line 6 Helix. Let's get into it. All of the episodes so far have been devoted to sound alone, but today I'm going to be focused on just two things: ease of use and depth of control. And that's it. If you only care about what these units sound like, this isn't the episode for you. Of course, I think sound matters more than anything, which is why I've devoted all the previous parts of the series to sound alone, but of course, an important part of any amp modeler is getting immersed with it, getting comfortable with it, and being able to use it like you would an actual amp or an actual effect. And of course, when you hear something that you want to change, you want to be able to change that quickly and easily. But to be clear, I am not going to give you a tutorial on how to use either of these units. That's just not what I do. I'm a reviewer, and the information that I'm providing is for people who are prospectively deciding between these two units, not people that already have these units and want to learn how to use them. That's just not my purpose here. I'm going to start with ease of use. I'm bothered by the Helix's desktop interface slightly more than I am by Fractal's, mainly because it uses sliders instead of knobs. I understand this would probably help quite a bit if you were using a touchscreen. I personally am not, but I can imagine moving a slider is a little bit easier than moving a digital knob if you're using your fingers, and I do appreciate that this allows you to fit the window of the Helix editor to any size that you want on your screen. But sliders, they just feel strange to use, mainly because they aren't very commonly used in audio plugins, DAW plugins, especially when it comes to guitar stuff. I don't think it's too much to ask that manufacturers of these products, when they make a desktop editor for an amp modeler, they try and make that as much like a DAW plugin as they possibly can, because most of us are computer geeks who are already familiar with using those things. Following this logic, it is also a standard amongst DAW plugins to double-click a parameter to set it to neutral. Fractal does this great, but on the Helix, when you double-click a parameter, it does nothing. And that irritates me greatly. My main trouble with the AX8's editor isn't its usability, because I think it's very easy to use and navigate, at least from my personal perspective, but rather its speed. From what I've gathered, that's due to the fact that Fractal has many more parameters than the Helix does, and the USB connection that it runs on can only handle so much data running through it, and essentially becomes a bottleneck when you have that many parameters, that many numbers running through it that it needs to catch up on between the unit itself and the computer that you're using. This doesn't help when you add in the fact that the AX8 in particular does not have very much processing power devoted to the interface. This makes it so you can't instantly go between your computer editor and the hardware unit like you can on the Helix. I understand. I mentioned this in my AX8 review, and some people laughed it off as a non-issue, and I understand to many people it is. But personally, when I have the option to both use the unit itself and the computer editor at the same time, I embrace that. For example, if I have something programmed to a foot switch, like an effect bypass, a scene change, an XY change, instead of having to stop playing, grab my mouse, try and find my cursor, move my cursor to whatever I want it to do, I would like it, because I can see the foot switch right there, that it can easily do that. I can just hit the foot switch and move on like I would actually do in a live performance scenario. If you do that currently with the AX8 hooked up through USB, it pauses the AX8 editor, it allows you to do that switch, and it doesn't have any audio hiccups anymore, which I greatly appreciate. It allows you to do that change, but then when you click back to the editor, it takes a couple seconds to load back your parameters again. It doesn't immediately open up the block that you want to see. It's just a hindrance, because with the Helix, you can go back and forth instantly. The communication between the Helix and the computer is extremely fast. None of these issues are deal breakers to me when it comes to either unit. You know, the Helix is a little bit tougher to use on the desktop side, the Fractal is a little bit slower to use on the desktop side, but I don't think these should be deal breakers unless for some reason this really matters to you. I'm mentioning these because I think they're worth noting. Really, truly, both editors are extremely fun and extremely easy to use, and I think any potential user would get very comfortable with either of them within a matter of hours at the very least. I'd like to also note my preference of the Fractal block system over what Line 6 has running. Currently, it's a little awkward to create split signals or parallel paths inside the Helix compared to how you can do it on the Fractal. With the Fractal, you can quickly dart out of your main signal and back in with any parallel effects that you want to run. With the Helix, it's kind of weird. Whenever you want to run a parallel effect, like for instance, if you want to do a reverb running 100% wet or whatever sort of complicated scenario you're running, if you try to do a parallel path, it instantly gives you 8 blocks in a row. on that parallel path, which for me, I mean, I don't know a lot of people who do this sort of thing to begin with, but for me, that is totally unnecessary most of the time. And what this means is, because it takes up the entire length of the interface, you can't have multiple points for you to run multiple parallel paths. For instance, if you want to have like maybe a delay in front of your amp or a reverb after the fact, I don't know. But just to say, the Helix doesn't really allow you that sort of flexibility, which is a little bit of a bummer for me. Also on the Helix, I wish you had the option to get rid of that bottom path. It gives you, of course, the Helix is known for having so many different option routings and having so many different signals that it can process all at the same time, while the AX8 is much more streamlined, so that allows its interface to be a bit more simple in that regard. But the Helix, when you have that main guitar line up top basically all the time, and for a basic user like myself, that's all I ever use. And that bottom line, which you can devote to, like, if you want to run a microphone, if you're a singer-songwriter, or like a Variax input, whatever, if you want to have a separate parallel path running inside of your Helix, that's kind of just always hanging out. And I would personally like the option to either get rid of that, if for some reason that would free up some sort of resource, or just be able to hide that, because it's completely unnecessary for me most of the time, and other bare bones users, I'm sure, won't be using that path very often. Again, that's not like a deal breaker or anything. That shouldn't keep you from buying the Helix because, oh, there's a path there that I'm not going to use. It's not that big of a deal, but it's just something I noticed. Okay, moving on to the hardware. There is a lot of hate out there for the AX8 interface, and to be clear, I think a lot of it is justified. I know I spew a lot of Fractal love on this channel because I love the AX8 and it's definitely my preferred unit, but I think a lot of the criticism of the AX8 user interface is very, very much justified, because I hate using it as well. But to be fair, I think it does what it's made to do, which sucks. It really does suck to hear, but because this wasn't designed for you to build your patches on the unit itself, like on the Helix. These are two separate devices that were created to do two slightly different things as far as interface goes. With the AX8, clearly the idea is for you to design your patches with a computer or a laptop hooked up to it, and then when you get into a live situation in which you probably can't bring your desktop, you can make any last minute tweaks, and of course they give you the easy access amp controls, which kind of signify to the fact that these are for last minute tweaks. That's what the user interface on the AX8 is for. And I know, I mean, when it's clearly the Helix is a much more attractive, much more easy to use package, but the AX8, I think, to be perfectly honest, it does what it's made to do. However, you know, I've seen Cliff from Fractal site because you know, he knows for a fact that most of his users prefer using their computer editors anyway, so he doesn't invest a lot of resources into the front panels of his units, and that makes perfect sense, because I think a majority of his users definitely do use computer editors. However, I think there are a few changes that could be made to the next revision of the AX8, the Mark II, or the XL, whatever they're going to call it. I think there are some changes that can be made that wouldn't jack up the price point a lot, you know, it wouldn't make it a complete, you know, Helix rival in the interface department, but would help out a lot when it comes to the interface right now. Mainly, I want a joystick, like the Helix, really badly, because right now the system in which you move your cursor, it's really strange having to move in two directions using only knobs. And if you don't know what I mean here, imagine yourself using an Etch-a-Sketch, but that's your computer cursor. I know that's kind of a weird analogy to make, but it's really the best way for me to put it. You have one knob devoted to moving left and right, and one knob devoted to moving up and down. And this gets slightly irritating because the knobs aren't notched or anything, so you don't know exactly how much of a turn it takes to move, you know, your cursor from place to place, from block to block. And not to mention the function buttons are far away from the navigation buttons, so you have to reach over there to move them. It's weird. That's really the best way for me to put it. Now, the Axe Effects, on the other hand, has a directional pad, which I think is great. And a lot of people have said, you know, a directional pad on the AX8 would be awesome, but that's just not possible with how little space there is on the front end, and you would have to, or on the front panel, and you would have to sacrifice the easy access amp controls in order to have a directional pad. And that's true. I think that's true, which is why I think a joystick is the most space effective option. I saw the Helix had it, and I was like, huh, this would be pretty nice to have. So I think replacing the E knob on the AX8 with a little joystick and moving the buttons over, as I said in my dedicated AX8 review, it's really weird having that row of buttons over so far away from the navigation controls when you're really going back and forth between them often. I would like those moved over and to have a joystick that would make it easier. You know, because with an Etch-a-Sketch, you're using 2 knobs, and it's a little harder to write using an Etch-a-Sketch than it is with using maybe a pencil. Just a thought. When it comes to the Helix, of course, I will join the choir of people who revel in the beauty of the Helix. I agree. I think it's a very wonderful user interface. There's very little learning curve to it, and I think anybody will get accustomed to it, even people that have never used AMP modelers before. I mean, aside from simply using it being super easy, it has some very, very cool tricks up its sleeve that I think are really great. I mean, it doesn't make up for the fact that I have my problems with the Helix in other regards, but it has some really cool options. My favorite is probably the hovering feature, in which, you know, you have an effect. Let's say you have like a tube screamer and you want to view those settings. Instead of having to reach down to the unit, navigate over to wherever the distortion block is, you can just hover your hand or hover a bare foot over the top of that foot switch, and it instantly views those settings without having to turn it on or turn it off. And that's so much fun, and actually very intuitive and helpful when you're dialing in patches on the unit itself, just so you can quickly see which blocks are set certain ways. And then also the entire edit control. I don't know who thought of this at line 6, but it is crazy brilliant. The whole entire editing scheme that you can do, you can tweak parameters and continue playing while just using your feet. You can use switches, you can use the expression pedal to change any parameter that you want on any of your blocks, which is simply brilliant. It's really fun to use. It's not like a utility that I use very often because I'm so used to computer editing anyway, but I just gotta give props to line 6 on that one. So to sum up what I would like to see from the Helix, most of them have to do, well, I guess all of them have to do technically with the desktop editor. I would like to see knobs on the editor rather than sliders. I would like to have double clicking on any parameter to set it to neutral, and optional elimination or hiding of the bottom path. From the future hardware AX8, if there is a next generation coming out anytime soon, I really want to see a joystick more than anything out of either of these units. I would like those function buttons to be moved over, and of course I would like the editor pausing, whether that's through upgrading up to USB 3.0 or Thunderbolt or something like that, or whether that's through upping the processing power in the unit itself. Just something to keep that pausing from happening is personally something I would like to see. I completely understand if that's not a top priority at Fractal, but those are just my thoughts. Now on to depth of control. I think there are a couple of really, really cool deep edits that Fractal allows you to do in the amp block. One of them, it gives you a graphic EQ for every single amp model that you load up, even if it's not an amp that actually has a graphic EQ, which is really helpful for quickly dialing out problem spots. You know, you don't have to load up a separate EQ block just because you hear too much, like 4K or 250, for example. Like, you can just easily notch those out using the Amp's EQ control, which is really useful and something I use just about on every single patch. Also, another really interesting thing, I don't use this extremely frequently, but it's something that I find really, really exciting actually, is to switch the tone stack of an amp to a different amp type. So you basically, like, for example, if you want a Friedman bass or a Plexi bass, let's say Friedman, for example, and you want to switch over to a Plexi tone stack, you basically keep the essential Friedman sound while shifting over slightly to the voicing of a Plexi, which allows you to create really cool hybrid designs of amps without having to, you know, run dual amp setups, without having to do, you know, any sort of complicated routing in that regard. It's just fun to mess around with and allows you to make slight tweaks to an amp that might make it into something perfect for you. But other than those two, personally speaking, everything else kind of scares me. And I think, I mean, I'm speaking as an average guitar player here, I think most of those really complicated controls kind of scare people. And that's okay, because it's easy to ignore them when it comes to the amp block. With the Helix's amp block, you're given a relatively simple set of controls that doesn't go crazily in depth. You're given your drive, bass, middle, treble, presence, channel volume, which is basically your level control, and a master volume. Those are your essential controls. And then it gets a little bit complicated with the sag, hum, ripple, bias, and bias X controls, but that is the extent of it. There are no other pages of, you know, parameters that you can mess with. And then with certain amp models, like for specifically the 5150, it gives you a resonance. Other amp models give you some more particular controls. But beyond that, there's not as much going on, especially compared to the Fractal, where if we take a look at something like, this is a Plexi model where it gives you 2 different channels. But if we go to a 5150, for example, you know, a relatively basic suite of controls here. Bright switches and cut and fat switches and boost. That's relatively complicated, at least compared to the Helix. But then where it really gets interesting is when you go into the other pages, the other menus here. You get a graphic EQ that I was talking about that I love so much, and then preamp controls with the tone stack switch, and this is where things, as I said, kind of start to get scary, where you have particular controls over the tubes and harmonics and CF comp, and then going over to power amp, you have negative feedback and bias excursion and power supply controls. You can switch between direct and alternating current, speaker interaction, dynamics, a whole bunch of stuff here that most people probably won't have the time or interest to learn about, but I mean, that's no big deal, because when you load up an amp model, it presets those to be model accurate to begin with, so it kind of does the work for you. But if you're really looking to make a particular amp model into something that's, you know, flawless and identical to something you have in mind, this might be something that interests you, and it's kind of nice to have those options. Taking a look at something like, I guess I'll go to the cab block first, where actually there's some striking similarities between the two. Regardless of which impulse you're using, whether that's a user cab or a factory cab, you're given low and high cut filter slopes for those, and then a proximity effect. On the Helix, it is strikingly similar. You're given your distance parameter, which controls your proximity. That's essentially the equivalent to proximity, low and high cut, and early reflections. So both of them are pretty darn similar in the cab block regard. Like if I open up even the impulse response block, which has a separate block for the on the Helix, it's separate from the cab block, of course. You have your choice of IR, then you're given low and high cut, so it's relatively similar as far as depth of control on the cabinet block. Going to something like a distortion pedal, I'm going to use a tube screamer here. I'm not going to actually play through it, but just for example, a tube screamer, Helix does a good job of, you know, exemplifying 3 knobs on a tube screamer, 3 parameters here. Going over to the Fractal, it's a little bit more intimidating. You just have to learn what to ignore. So you have drive, tone, and level. Those are basically the 3 knobs that you get on the tube screamer in real life, and those are model accurate in this regard. But they also give you low and high cut parameters over the clipping section, and then also choice of diodes and a 3-band EQ, and then also bias and bit reduction. Bit reduction is actually really fun to play with if you're doing some super lo-fi stuff, and sample rate. Like, you can really mess around with the different distortion types, and regardless of which one you're using, you're basically given those same parameters regardless of which type of distortion you're using. While the Helix, on the other hand, it depends on the type. Like if you load up a full tone CD, gives you more accurate parameters dependent on which one you're using, which in my opinion is a bit more user-friendly, especially if you're familiar with, I guess not a megaphone, but if you're more familiar with using something like a clon. Like it gives you the actual, well, I guess Fractal doesn't have a clon, but still it gives you the actual parameters that those pedals provide when it comes to distortion. Going over to reverb, as I said in the effects comparison, they basically give you the essential reverb types and nothing more, nothing too crazy aside from, you know, like a particle verb, which is kind of out there. Yeah, it gives you stable, critical, and hazard there. But for the most part, for the essential reverb types, it gives you a pretty basic suite of controls here. Decay, pre-delay, low and high cut, and then mix, level, and trails. Those are kind of utility controls. Going over to the reverb block on the Fractal, again, it gives you basically the same amount of control regardless of the block. It doesn't change depending on the model that you're using. But it gives you, even just on the basic page, gives you some more complicated controls, looking at stereo width, echo density, stuff like that, choice over quality. I think hold is just like trails, but then it also gives you an advanced control where you have control over each of the reflections, an EQ point where it also gives you a low and high cut, but also 2 parametric bands and a ducking section. So the Fractal allows you to go quite a bit more in depth, not to mention it also includes quite a few more presets, I guess preset reverb types than the Helix does. So personally, I prefer the Fractal in this regard, even though it is a bit more complicated, a bit more hard to use. For the most part, I just mess with the time parameter and the mix parameter to try and make it sound the way that I want it to, and I just switch between different reverb types. Taking a look at something like delay, this is also a very similar thing. I mean, again, as I said earlier, I really don't like the slider interface of the Helix, so this is something that is intimidating to me in a different way. But for the most part, the Helix is pretty simple when it comes to delays, depending on the type that you're using. I'm just going to take a look at simple digital mono, yeah. Just a simple delay here, time feedback, mix level. Don't know what scale does, but this is a pretty basic control scheme. Of course, the tempo sync up here, that's kind of linked together with the time if you want to get into tap tempo. While the Fractal, on the other hand, even on the basic page, it gives you some pretty complicated controls, gives you a ducking section, 2 modulation parameters going into LFOs and stuff like that, EQ section with, again, 2 parametric bands as you had on the reverb, and yeah, it just overall gives you more control over a relatively simple delay type. Of course, things get a little bit more complicated, and, you know, different types of parameters get introduced with different delay types, actually, when you go into different, and I'm not going to go into all those today, but just generally speaking, the Fractal gives you multiple pages of different options that you can dig into for most effects and amp types. If you're at all worried that the Helix might not give you enough parameters for you to do what you need, for most people, I really don't think that will be an issue. Even though the Fractal clearly exceeds them as far as parameter numbers go, I think when you want to change something on the Helix, you're able to change it. I mean, this doesn't make up for the fact that I think they're lacking quite a few key amp models, and I think their cabinets sound relatively weak because no amount of user friendliness or, you know, tweaking capability can make up for that fact, in my opinion. But as far as depth of control goes, yes, technically Fractal hands down wins the depth of control award if that's something you're curious about and you want, you know, this massive amount of options. But personally, my personal winner for this depth of control is the Helix, because even though it's simpler, you know, it gives you what you need, and it gives you the options to change what you need. That about does it for this. I'll be back again. I think the next episode is going to be a more live amp plus cab run through, kind of just sitting down with these units. All the previous comparisons I've done have been super scientific, but next time I'm kind of just going to throw off that hat and completely go subjective on it and dial in the tones that I like out of both of them, since I've had quite a few people request that. Yeah, that one's going to be fun, and then I think I'm going to wrap this series up right after that and then move on to few other exciting things. But thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Check out the other episodes in the series if you're curious to hear what these 2 units sound like, and I'll see you next time.